online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 10, I'm Nadira Tudor. Government to hold more crisis talks with the energy regulator over rising gas prices. Why is a new defence deal causing controversy for new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss? And 3 days in space, the first all-civilian team ever to orbit the Earth returned safely. Ministers are racing to prevent food shortages due to a sudden reduction of carbon dioxide used by the food and drink industry. An increase in the cost of fuel has resulted in a deficit of CO2 gas, which is used in the process of meat production. Online supermarket Ocado has warned that it's unable to deliver frozen goods because of a lack of dry ice. Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng says there is no cause for immediate concern. The new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has defended the UK security pact with the US and Australia amid a deepening diplomatic row with France. The AUKUS deal will see Australia provided with nuclear-powered submarines by the US and the UK rather than getting conventional submarines from France. Liz Truss says it's a deal that may bring hundreds of jobs to the UK. In retaliation, France pulled its ambassadors out of Australia and the US, claiming the pact was made behind their back. But Australia's PM, Scott Morrison, says he's doing what's best for national interest.
Australia's national interest comes first. It must come first, and it did come first. And Australia's interests are best served by the trilateral partnership that I've been able to form with President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson.
Boris Johnson is heading to the UN and the White House this week for the first time since Joe Biden became president. He's expected to push Biden on the looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and the potential of reopening UK to US travel. He'll also appear at the UN's General Assembly in New York to urge world leaders to take concrete action on climate change. Starting tomorrow, texts and letters will be sent out to 1.5 million people who are eligible for a third coronavirus vaccine. Those eligible for the booster include the over 50s, people living and working in care homes for the elderly, frontline health and social care workers. It will also include anyone who's clinically extremely vulnerable. The SpaceX capsule carrying the first all-civilian crew into space has touched back down on Earth after 3 days in orbit. The 4 amateurs splashed down successfully off the Florida coast. It was the first expedition launched into Earth's orbit without a career astronaut on board. And the annual charity Skinny Dip is taking place this morning in the northeast. Naked swimmers return to the waters to raise money for the mental health charity Mind. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter, quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Good morning and welcome to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. It's 4 minutes past 10. It is Sunday morning, the 19th of September. And as I look outside, there's a little bit of blue, but it's still fairly grey. And the news is extraordinary after yet another unbelievable week. And I'm going to be asking the key question: have the lunatics taken over the asylum? I want your calls, your tweets, your texts. And I'm going to have a regular Sunday sermon as my monologue. And this week's Sunday sermon is: who's in charge? Who is in charge? Who's in charge on the decision for vaccinating children? Is it the parents or is it the children? Who's in charge of the decision whether under 16s should be able to take puberty blockers? Is it the parents or is it the children? Who's in charge of our gas prices? Who's in charge of our M25 junctions? Who's in charge of BBC News? And much, much more besides. And my big Sunday debate, this will get you going. Make sure you call about this one. Is it our duty to protect the NHS? Or maybe it's the NHS's duty to protect us, the patients? Will we accept more restrictions? I want your calls, your thoughts on this, and there's much, much more besides. So call me 0344 499 1000, text to talk at 87222, tweet at Talk Radio, and I'll read out some tweets and some messages. And of course, you can watch us live on TV. Download the Talk Radio TV app, or on YouTube, Apple TV, Samsung, Rakuten. There is no excuse whatsoever not to watch us, not to be in charge. You're listening to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB, and on your smart speaker. This is Talk Radio.
Well, a very good morning to you, and I really do need to start the show, and we've got a great 3 hours ahead, but I really need to ask the big fundamental question. Who's in charge here, folks? Have our leaders, our decision makers, have they really lost the plot? Have some of them gone AWOL? Have they gone bonkers? I mean, have we literally handed the keys to the asylum over to our children? I mean, this is the week, at the beginning of the week just gone, our Chief Medical Officer, Chris Whitty, concluded, after rejecting the advice of the supposed world experts, the JCVI, he concluded that 12 and 13-year-old children are capable of making complex medical judgments about what's good for them. He thinks they're capable of reading the JCVI statement and assessing the risks and the benefits of taking the vaccine. He thinks they can understand the potential harms against the magnitude of the potential unknown harms. He thinks they can understand the risks of myocarditis. Really? I mean, tell me what your kids are like on a weekday morning when they're struggling to decide which textbook to put in the school bag. When children sort of can't decide whether to have one Weetabix or two, or whether to have Weetabix or cornflakes in the morning, and they're capable of making medical judgments. You tell me what you think. Are you happy with children making that decision? Maybe you are. I find it extraordinary. I really do. And then we have, at the end of the week, the learned judges in the Court of Appeal have concluded, they've overturned the previous ruling, the previous precedent. They've concluded that children under the age of 16 are capable of deciding on their own, making their own informed consent as to whether or not they should have potentially life-changing puberty blockers. They're really saying that actually the children, along with the clinician, can make that decision, and the parent is no longer in charge. Are you happy with that? Do you think that's right, that the children should be in charge of that decision at a time when, and I quote, NHS England say, little is known about the long-term side effects of hormone or puberty blockers in children with gender dysphoria. Little is known about the impacts on brain development and psychological health. I mean, for heaven's sake, the amount of discussion and debate and angst about whether or not children should have the vaccines, and yet it seems that NHS England seem quite relatively comfortable that under 16s should take puberty blockers, even though the medium and long-term effects is unknown. I mean, is this the thin end of the wedge? What comes next? Where does this stop? Because, you know what happens when you open the door. It is literally the thin end of the wedge, and then the door gets pushed open wider and wider. Well, that's parents or children being in charge. Meanwhile, over at the state broadcaster, yes, it's the BBC, they've created a new management post, an executive news editor, as if they haven't got enough already. And of course, the qualification for the job was you had to be a left-winger, so they've duly appointed someone who previously ran the left-wing website called Huffington Post, a lady, I'm sure she's very nice, called Jess Bramer, a lady who hardly could be described as impartial, given that she's been highly critical of Brexit, highly critical of the Conservative government. I mean, what on earth's going on? The BBC is supposed to be impartial with its news and unbiased, but I guess this just confirms that's not the case. Well, and then we discover in the last couple of days who's in charge of our energy prices. Well, it's clearly not people here in the UK. I talked a couple of weeks ago about my concerns about the influence of a Chinese billionaire owning potentially the biggest owner of UK utilities, and the strategic risks and the financial risks of that. But now it turns out that actually we face huge hikes in energy prices as we speak, and yet that decision appears to be made by the Russian-owned state energy company Gazprom, which basically means Vladimir is in charge of gas prices. Are you happy with that? Are you comfortable with that? Call me, ring me, tweet me, text me. I think it's wrong. I think it's really, really risky. I think it's dangerous, and I'm not comfortable with it. But maybe you are. And our Secretary of State for Business, one Kwasi Kwarteng, he helpfully reassured us by saying that security of supply is not an immediate cause for concern. Well, bearing in mind the discussion we had last week, folks, when I think we concluded comprehensively that we didn't trust a single word this government says, you know full well that when the Secretary of State for Business says it's not a cause for immediate concern, that means it's a cause for serious immediate concern. He went on to say the gas system continues to operate reliably and we do not expect supply emergencies this winter. That worries me, because I think we should almost believe literally the opposite. Meanwhile, if you've been trying to get around the M25 this week, ring us, tell us about the stories that you've had, because it turns out that the M25 junctions, it's not Highways England who are in charge of them. You might have thought that. You might have thought that the police were in charge of controlling and running our roads and our M25 junctions. No, far from it. It turns out that actually some folks, some protesters, some eco-zealots, and something none of us had ever heard of called Insulate Britain, that they're in charge of the M25 junctions. They blocked them, they stopped them. Give us a call if you suffered. I mean, I find it unbelievable. Look, I'll defend to the hilt the right to protest, but that does not give you the right to obstruct. It does not give you the right to disrupt. It doesn't give you the right to stop people getting to a doctor's appointment that they've been waiting for 2 or 3 weeks. It does not give you the right to prevent someone getting to hospital for an operation they've been waiting for months and months and months. It does not give you the right to prevent people from earning a living, from lorries being able to get to supermarkets because there are some empty shelves. It does not give you the right to stop businesses desperately trying to get going again after the COVID crisis. I think their actions have been selfish. I think their actions have been arrogant. I think totally unreasonable. And whatever cause that you protest about, then you seriously damage your interests if you actually put people off your cause. And I think that Insulate Britain have done their cause a massive amount of harm in the way of their actions. But I think also serious questions need to be asked about the policing of this. I mean, just imagine if actually that had been anti-lockdown protesters, for example. You can bet your bottom dollar that the police would have been there in a jiffy and would have whisked them off to the cells where they would have enjoyed some hospitality, courtesy of the police for some time. But not these protesters. No. These are clearly the right sort of protesters. Who's in charge here, folks? I mean, I just think that is so wrong. But maybe you think I'm maybe a bit harsh. Maybe you're quite happy that they blocked the roads. There is some good news though, folks. Because who's in charge of education in this country? Yes, it's no longer our Gavin, or Frank Spencer as some people call him. He is no longer in charge of education. But you may need to doff your cap to Gavin, because apparently the deal done is arise, Sir Gavin. There'll be more on that in the coming months. So tell me who you think's in charge, and are you happy with what's going on? Call me 0344 499 1000. Text us or tweet us. And oh, that's very nice. Karen's just tweeted in. She said, "Richard, I wish you were in charge." Well, who knows, Karen? But anyway, that's the Here Endeth the Sermon on this Sunday, the 19th of September. Here endeth the sermon. You may want to disappear off to church or whatever, but that's my sermon. You're listening to Tice Talk. It is, of course, the home of common sense, the home of free speech. It's Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter, quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio, and I'm afraid I've got some sad news to break for you now. Jimmy Greaves, the former England, Tottenham and Chelsea footballer, has died aged 81 after a long battle against dementia. It appears that he passed away in the early hours of this morning, and I know that will be of sadness to many, many football lovers up and down the country. So we've got tweets coming in. One here from Angela, who says that she's read the JCVI statement, and the only reason that children would take the vaccine is because of coercion, peer pressure and bullying. Do you agree? What are your thoughts? And now we need to talk about these Insulate Britain protests around the M25 junctions that actually caused huge disruption to many people trying to go to work, trying to go to appointments, trying to earn a living, trying to run a business. And we need to sort of understand the reaction, the response of the police, whether it was appropriate, whether it was too slow, whether it was about right. And I'm really keen to get your thoughts on this. And I'm delighted to be joined this morning by a former Metropolitan Police Chief Superintendent, Dal Babu, to discuss this further. A very good morning to you this Sunday, Dal. Thank you for being with me. So this was obviously
Richard.
Good morning. I guess it was probably a surprise to the various police forces involved. I think it's 5 or 6 of them. These protests, they sort of appeared very suddenly, and essentially a bit of a new one for them. But we did see some extraordinary video footage, and I guess in the world of social media, it makes it harder. It makes it much more sort of, how these social media clips go viral. But I think a lot of people felt a bit uncomfortable when, the frontline police officers, obviously making the judgments that they made, but in a sense, asking the protesters whether they were comfortable, whether they're okay, if they had any questions. What have you heard? What's your feeling about the responses of the different forces on the different days of these protests?
Well, I think, as you said, Richard, this is quite complex because it's not just one police service that is dealing with this. You have several police forces that are dealing with this, which makes it much more complicated in terms of the command and control structure. So they all need to coordinate. But I think you need to be remembering very, very clearly that there is a danger. You've got traffic travelling at 70 miles an hour. You've got police officers who would be attending there. And we need to make sure that those individuals are safe, the motorists are safe, and we have a duty to every individual involved. I think the police acted very, very quickly and robustly, but they needed sufficient resources in order to move people on. And I think the police did a very good job because they made sure that they had coordinated resources, had to get through the traffic as quickly as possible. And then once they were there, the individuals were removed very, very quickly. And remember, we have a number of individuals who are now waiting to go to court. And so I think the police did well under these new tactics that are being deployed. And there would have been a lot of frustration. I think all of us accept that we have to do something about making sure that we have less carbon. But people get very, very frustrated because these kind of protests actually add to the carbon problem because you've actually got cars,
of course,
cars in big.
That's right, and I think as you say, we all know that we need to reduce emissions, but I don't think the way they went about it. I think the frustration and the anger and the fury, you saw that bubbling over with drivers getting out of their vehicles, trying to remove some of the protesters, and in a sense, it's a tense situation, isn't it, where the drivers feel that the police either haven't arrived quick enough or they're not being robust enough in their response, and people just want to get about their daily lives. It's just difficult, and I think people feel very frustrated.
Yeah, no, absolutely. But I think I think we should really pay respect and to the police officers because I think. We shouldn't underestimate how complicated it becomes when you've got several police forces involved. So these are all the people who would have arrived initially would have been, PCs, sergeants who are sort of operational at that level. They would perhaps need to speak to the hierarchy to find out exactly what happens. I think the frustration is that there was huge tailbacks, but I think the police acted very, very quickly. So this was not the kind of things we had with Extinction Rebellion, where the whole of central London was brought to a halt for days.
I would say from what I saw of it, that actually the police's response got faster as they realised the nature of the changing tactics, and obviously the Home Secretary waded in to the essentially to the issue. There is this question, obviously, of as I understand, it's Section 37 of the Highways Act, and you can't willfully obstruct the highway, and there's a maximum fine, I think I'm right, of about £1,000. But of course, you've got the situation where, in a sense, the police, they can remove the protesters, but they can't, in a sense, they can't stop them just being there the following day or a couple of days later, and that I guess also irritates people.
Well, that entirely depends on what the individuals are charged with. If they're charged with a specific offence, i.e. assault, They might be or causing criminal damage. So they might have damaged some of the property while they're protesting, or they might have assaulted emergency worker. Then they can have conditions placed on them. So that there are things that the police can do. But if you're in the middle of nowhere, you've got to make sure that you've got all your infrastructure and support there before you start making arrests. So if you arrest somebody, you've got to then have them put into a vehicle to be transported and then taken to, if you've got 70, 80 individuals, you've got to have the cell space as well. So I think we just need to really fully understand that the police acted very, very quickly. They acted very robustly. We live in a democracy. We're not China or Russia here. People are allowed to protest, but when they cause this level of disruption, they need to be dealt with firmly. And I think they were. And I think the police did this as quickly as they could, in the middle of nowhere.
Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting, and I'm hoping that some of our viewers and listeners may have either experienced, or a friend or family member of theirs may have experienced these protests. Sort of give us their own views. I think it's that I really do sort of view it as counterproductive. I call it selfish behaviour of these protesters. But tell me now, looking forwards, there's the new police crime and sentencing bill going through the Houses of Parliament. I'm not quite sure when that's likely to become law, but some people are saying that would in a sense enhance the ability of the police to deal with this sort of situation. Is that your understanding?
I think we've got sufficient powers. I think what you've seen here is the way the Extinction Rebellion was dealt with, and the way that this protest was dealt with was entirely different. This was dealt with very quickly, very robustly, and very firmly. The original Extinction Rebellion, people held up central London for several days. So I think we have sufficient powers. I think the new legislation will inevitably lead to challenges. So I'm not entirely sure how that would help, because whenever you have new legislation, people will challenge the legislation when it actually starts going to court. But this was using standard old legislation, as you said, obstruction of the highway, and the individuals were removed as quickly as possible. I think we need to be a bit wary of social media footage, because people will send the social media footage that supports their particular cause. But I think if you listen to what the police have said, they were aware of this. They sent their resources. Resources were diverted from fighting burglary, robbery, crime, assault, and they were sent to this. But they also needed to make sure that people who attended this were sufficiently understanding of the dangers of motorways.
But actually, you really hit it on the head there. And I talked about this a couple of weeks ago, Dal, in terms of if police are called out to a protest like this in large numbers, as you said, to ensure it's safe on motorway junctions, it is diverting police away from what most ordinary citizens would consider as the core role, which is being on the streets, hopefully preventing crime or catching criminals. And if you're diverting them away from that, then again, I think that sort of it reinforces my view that these protesters, in the way they did this, actually have really been quite selfish to other citizens and communities. And I just think it's not on.
Yeah, I mean, if you remember what happened a couple of years ago in the tube at Custom House, when people were travelling to work,
yes,
and we had Extinction Rebellion get on the tube, people took the law into their own hands, and these individuals were dragged off and given a good hiding. Certainly, we shouldn't be encouraging people to do that, but it's quite clear that these individuals are sometimes they don't fully understand that ordinary people, not on a lot of minimum wage, are trying to get to might be cleaning jobs and wherever you're not going to be paid a lot of money.
Yeah.
So yes, I think it's important to ensure that people have the right to protest, but when you have huge disruption like this, it's counterproductive.
Exactly.
Indeed.
Dal, thank you so much indeed for those thoughts. Your view that actually the police did put up a good response. I'm looking forward to my listeners' response on there. That was Dal Babu, former Met Police Chief Superintendent, regarding the M25 junction protest by Insulate Britain. My view is absolutely clear. I think they were selfish. I think they were disruptive. I think it's outrageous. And I think we've got to act firmer and faster. The time is 10:30. It's time for the news. You're listening to Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Government to hold more crisis talks with the energy regulator over rising gas prices. Why is a new defence deal causing controversy for new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss? Ministers are racing to prevent food shortages in the UK due to a sudden reduction of carbon dioxide used by the food and drink industry. An increase in the cost of fuel has resulted in a deficit of CO2 gas, which is used in the process of meat production. Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng insisted there was no cause for immediate concern. The new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has defended the UK's security pact with the US and Australia amid a deepening diplomatic row with France. The AUKUS deal will see Australia provided with nuclear-powered submarines by the US and the UK, rather than getting conventional submarines from France. Liz Truss says it's a hard-headed deal that may bring hundreds of jobs to the UK. Boris Johnson is heading to the UN and the White House this week for the first time since Joe Biden became president. He's expected to push Biden on the looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and the potential of reopening UK to US travel. He'll also appear at the UN's General Assembly in New York. And the SpaceX capsule carrying the first all-civilian crew into space has touched back down on Earth after 3 days in orbit. The 4 amateurs splashed down successfully in the Atlantic off the Florida coast. It was the first expedition launched into Earth's orbit without a career astronaut on board at an estimated cost of £145 million. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. It's 10:33, and I think it's fair to say that some of the listeners and viewers don't agree with Dal Babu, the former chief superintendent from the Met. We've got one here saying that the police officers, former officers, not correct. They never moved them quickly and robustly. They broke the law and should have been thrown in a cell. And another one here from Paul says 3 hours to clear the first one, and he thinks that's acting fast and responsibly. Throw them in a cell, and that will sort them out. So I think some pretty clear thoughts there. We've got our first caller of the morning, David in London. Good morning, David. What are your thoughts on these Insulate Britain protests? Hi there.
Yes. Yeah, Richard, I wasn't directly affected because I wasn't in the traffic, but I was affected indirectly because I think to myself, what on earth are these people going to do next? And I felt so sorry for all those people stuck in traffic.
Absolutely right, and where they were trying to go, and what they're trying to do, and you've hit it on the head. Actually, you know, these protesters, they're obviously thinking outside the box. They're coming up with new ways, but it's coming up with new ways to disrupt and frustrate and anger people. It's not coming up with new ways to get some sympathy to whatever cause they might be protesting about.
Yeah. And also, Richard, it's symptomatic of what is going on elsewhere. I mean, look at London's roads. Half of the road space in many parts of it have been given over to cyclists. Bus lanes converted into cycle lanes. You know, people feel, you know.
You're absolutely right, David. And we see that in London as people are coming back to work after the summer break, working from home. people are getting back to the office. It is quite clear the traffic in London is utterly horrendous again. David, thank you so much for your call. Keep calling us back. Keep the messages and tweets coming. 0344 499 1000. We're going to move on to my Sunday debate, which is the topic of which is, of course, the issue of winter lockdowns. Is it the duty of us to protect the NHS, or is it the NHS's duty to protect us, the patients? We had last week the Prime Minister and Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance talking about the risks of more restrictions. And I want to hear from you whether you would accept any more restrictions, any more. They won't call them lockdowns, they'll just call them restrictions. But would you accept further restrictions during the run-up to this winter? And I'm delighted to be joined first by Dr. Martin Edibor, who is the Clinical Director of the North Newham Primary Care Network and a GP for the NHS. Martin, thank you for joining us this Sunday morning. So, in a sense, I guess the Prime Minister was, if one's sort of optimistic about this, he was managing expectations about the risks that may lie ahead. I think he was calling it a sort of a plan B. And I guess the question is, lots of people may be asking, well, why isn't, what is the NHS sufficiently prepared? Has it built up some capacity to deal with, in a sense, whatever the pandemic COVID throws at us, or a flu epidemic throws at us? Or is it just hoping for the best?
First of all, thank you, Richard, for having me on this morning. As you mentioned, the NHS is in a very difficult situation at the moment, a crossroad, if you want to call it like that. We're still experiencing a significant number of COVID-19 cases entering hospitals. Compared to this time last year, we have around 50% more patients with COVID-19 in intensive care in our hospitals across the UK. As you mentioned, the Prime Minister has proposed his roadmap ahead. That is currently implementing Plan A, which involves vaccinating 12 to 15-year-olds, as well as giving booster vaccines to priority groups and encouraging the unvaccinated to be to have the vaccine. He also mentioned Plan B. A lot of medical professionals like myself are actually calling on the government to act fast and act now, and start thinking about implementing some of the Plan B measures, which includes thinking about reintroducing mask mandates, thinking about also when it comes to some of the social distancing rules, considering when that may be implemented and maybe being a bit more proactive with that. I know
but
that
Martin,
go ahead.
Martin, do you really think that the public would agree and accept those sort of restrictions again? Or do you agree with me that I think the mood has changed? The mood has shifted amongst the population at large?
For me, what should be the focus is the health of the nation and trying to avert a crisis in the same way, similar crisis that we had last year. And what that means really is not waiting for the NHS to be overwhelmed, but acting proactively. The question about whether the public would be open to further restrictions or, further rules and regulations over their lives, I think what the public wants is for the government to do their first, job, and that's to protect the health of the nation.
So I wrote an article a couple of weeks ago, which some people agreed with, but a lot of people didn't, when I actually proposed, and my plan B, Martin, was that actually we should rebuild the Nightingale hospitals, and that we should actually engage a medical reserve, a bit like the TA with the army, of retired medics and nurses and doctors, so that and to do that now, because then you'd have about sort of between 5 and 10% capacity of beds, so that you were prepared for the worst. Obviously, you plan and hope for the best, but as you've just inferred, you can't wait until the middle of winter to respond. You've got to respond now. And my suggestion was actually build some additional capacity. We've been through the dress rehearsal of them, and I didn't agree with them being taken down, but we are where we are. What do you think to that idea? Do you agree that we should be rebuilding them? I noted in the last couple of days there's already a call in Scotland to rebuild the Scottish Nightingale in order to give them some capacity.
So, Richard, your suggestion about rebuilding resilience and thinking about having that reserved ready just in case we do see an additional surge or, God forbid, a new variant. I think that is a sensible thing to consider. As you mentioned just then, in Scotland and in Northern Ireland, the army is supporting overwhelmed hospitals, showing that in some parts of our nation, they are already reaching that capacity. But, this is one option among a number of things which the government should be considering. We have a number of different options to consider, such as mask mandates, which we can start putting forward to avert a disaster.
If you think masks make much difference, and I guess there's question marks about that, but I really feel that it was Disraeli, former Prime Minister twice, in the 1800s. It was Disraeli who said that you should prepare for the worst and plan and hope for the best. And I just think that we've got to be a bit bolder about those preparations and be prepared to really think outside the box rather than just assume that the population will accept more restrictions. That's what really worries me, Martin.
Yeah, so that's an important point. One of the things that we need to be clear about is the responsibility that the Conservative government has, and a lot of these decisions are being made by ministers and also being led by the Prime Minister, and we must really hold Boris Johnson, Javid, and the cabinet to account for how they respond in the coming weeks and months. Healthcare professionals from across the country and healthcare leaders have been sounding the alarm bells that although things seem calm on the outside, the NHS is starting to experience the strain, and measures can be proactively taken now to help to reduce the strain going forward into the winter.
Indeed. And just finally, before I let you go, Martin, so you're a GP in a GP surgery, is that right?
That's correct.
And how are you seeing things? What sort of percentage are you back face-to-face appointments as opposed to phone appointments or Zoom appointments?
Thank you, Richard, for asking this question, because I think it's a really important one. So for me and many of my colleagues in general practice, we've been working really hard to reopen and improve access in primary care. In my GP practice, we are seeing patients face-to-face a majority of the time. About 70 to 80% of our consultations are face-to-face. Only a small number are remote or telephone. And, this has been a really hot topic in the media at the moment. And I know that I and my colleagues in general practice have been working hard to ensure that all patients have access to a face-to-face appointment.
It sounds like you're doing much better than many others, Martin, and thank you for that, because I know that patients up and down the country really do appreciate that. That was Dr. Martin Edibor, a GP and clinical director of North Newham Primary Care Network. Thank you very much for those thoughts. Tell us what you think, whether you think we should rebuild the Nightingales, whether you would be prepared to wear masks and to accept restrictions if we get further into winter and there's some form of whether it's a new variant, whether it's a flu epidemic or whatever. I want to hear your thoughts, your views as we head towards winter and we see the case numbers at around the current levels and the hospital numbers at around the current levels. Coming up after the break, we'll be talking to Dr. Anthony Hinton with his thoughts, putting the other side of the argument about whether or not it's the duty of us to protect the NHS or the NHS to protect us, the patient. You're listening to Tice Talk. It's 10:45, and this is, of course, the home of common sense. It's Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter, quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. It's 10:49. We've been talking about Insulate Britain. We're now talking about the issue of whether we should protect the NHS or whether the NHS should protect us. And after the top of the hour, in the second hour, we're going to be talking about whether or not we should be changing the BBC licence fee, whether we should defund the BBC, given what's going on there, given their waste, as well as the latest on the cladding scandal. So much, much more to come up. And I want to hear your thoughts, your views, 0344 499 1000. Well, for the second half of my big Sunday debate, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Tony Hinton, retired NHS consultant surgeon, to discuss the nature of potential restrictions and whether or not we should rebuild the Nightingale, how we build capacity. And I want to hear your thoughts. Would you accept more restrictions from this government if they've had time to get ready for whatever the winter throws at us? Tony, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. So,
Morning, Richard. Thank you for having me on.
I don't know if you heard the GP there, Martin Edibor, with his comments.
I did.
But we heard the Prime Minister earlier this week talking about sort of Plan B. It's not quite clear whether he's got a Plan C or not. Plan A just seems to be to hope. But I wrote this article a couple of weeks ago about we've got to prepare for the worst, whatever the worst is. We've got to have some capacity. My suggestion was the Nightingales. I'm welcome to all ideas. What we can't do is just, in my view, just sort of pray that it's all right on the night. And I really question whether or not people will accept more restrictions. And I think, for me, I think people expect the NHS to have got their act together. But what are your thoughts on this, Tony?
Well, first of all, I'd say I hope people don't accept the restrictions, because by my thinking, the restrictions really have made no difference. What the lockdowns have done is caused more damage, which I'll perhaps come on to later. But the thing about the Nightingales is very important. The government have had a long time to prepare for this winter, and so far really have done next to nothing. It's negligence. Now, when they did the Nightingales before, if we look, for instance, at the Nightingale, the huge one that was built in the Excel Centre in London, the number of patients that Nightingale looked after was 59. Not a peak of 59. 59 was the total. And there were two problems. The first problem is, if a hospital wanted to send a patient to the Nightingale, they had to send funding and they had to send staff, because staff hadn't been sorted out. So what St Thomas's did was, when St Thomas's ITUs got overwhelmed, St Thomas's has a long-standing relationship with Addenbrooke's in Cambridge, with their medical students backwards and forwards. They sent patients out to Addenbrooke's to help them out. And gradually, as the COVID wave spread out of London towards Cambridge, the opposite happened, and Cambridge sent their patients to St Thomas's.
So that was, I mean, there were clearly issues then which the government didn't really admit to in any way, and they sort of pretended that the Nightingales were still there on standby. Yeah, I was the guy who actually called them out on it when I stood in the empty halls. All the beds had gone.
Yes,
and the former health secretary lied in the House of Commons and said they were still there. But going forwards, it's just not good enough, in my view, for the government, not to have done something different. And just shoving a few billion quid into the NHS and hoping that that's going to make a difference, I don't see how it does. They've got to do something fundamental and different.
I'm afraid a few billion quid ends up with more managers. We saw some reports last week of new integrated care managers at £270,000 each, 42 of them, plus their entourage, of course, which is just ridiculous.
I think many of us were thinking of applying, actually, Tony.
Well, absolutely. I mean, double what the Prime Minister gets. I mean, people have their own thoughts about that. So I think absolutely the Nightingales is one way forward, but they have to be properly staffed and properly funded. The other thing that they can do is they can split hospitals or split across sites in hospitals to have COVID hospitals and non-COVID hospitals, so that they can run separately, and the non-COVID hospitals can just get on with all the normal work. I was speaking to a colleague surgeon in a hospital outside London just yesterday, and he said his hospital is on what's called a black alert. The hospital is so full already, it's getting its winter crisis in September. That means no ambulances can go there. They're all diverted 30 miles away. And I assumed that was because of COVID patients. But in fact, it is not. There are very few COVID patients. They're patients with delayed cancer diagnoses coming in. Patients that should have had their gallstones removed and have now got problems with pancreatitis or infected gallbladders. They're patients that haven't been dealt with during the lockdown that are now finally getting so bad they're turning up in hospital. And that is why that hospital is full, not COVID.
So I've been hearing this, but I've also been hearing of a hospital that's actually has started to cancel elective operations in September. So worried are they? It just feels to me that there's not, unless we're missing something, that they're not really giving us confidence that there's additional capacity there. Last time round, of course, they essentially rented lots of the private hospitals, but then hardly used them. Is that an option finally?
There's the independent sector, which the problem is it was hardly used before, really. A lot of that capacity just wasted. So it couldn't be used by the independent sector, and it wasn't used by the NHS either. But the problems are deeper. These problems go back for many years. I would say for the last 10 years I worked in the NHS, there was a winter crisis that began in September. That isn't at all unusual. But of course, the politicians now have the excuse of COVID to excuse their lack of properly reforming the NHS into a more continental European style system that works so much better.
Well, it feels to me, Tony, that the government and the NHS leaders, they're just praying. They're not giving us any confidence that there is additional capacity. Thank you so much for your thoughts on this Sunday morning about the question of whether or not the NHS is really going to be ready to protect us, whatever the whether it's what COVID throws at us, or whether it's just what a big flu epidemic throws at us. But give me your thoughts. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000, to tell me whether you would be prepared to accept any more restrictions, whether you actually think that the NHS is prepared for whatever may be thrown at us, and overall what your thoughts are. Is the NHS ready or not? It's 10:57. You're listening to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB, and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Government to hold more crisis talks with the energy regulator over rising gas prices. Why is a new defence deal causing controversy for new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss? Ministers are racing to prevent food shortages in the UK due to a sudden reduction of carbon dioxide used by the food and drink industry. An increase in the cost of fuel has resulted in a deficit of CO2 gas, which is used in the process of meat production. Business Secretary Kwasi Kwarteng insisted there was no cause for immediate concern. The new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has defended the UK's security pact with the US and Australia amid a deepening diplomatic row with France. The AUKUS deal will see Australia provided with nuclear-powered submarines by the US and the UK, rather than getting conventional submarines from France. Liz Truss says it's a hard-headed deal that may bring hundreds of jobs to the UK. Boris Johnson is heading to the UN and the White House this week for the first time since Joe Biden became president. He's expected to push Biden on the looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and the potential of reopening UK to US travel. He'll also appear at the UN's General Assembly in New York. And the SpaceX capsule carrying the first all-civilian crew into space has touched back down on Earth after 3 days in orbit. The 4 amateurs splashed down successfully in the Atlantic off the Florida coast. It was the first expedition launched into Earth's orbit without a career astronaut on board at an estimated cost of £145 million. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Government to hold more crisis talks with the energy regulator over rising gas prices. Why is a new defence deal causing controversy for new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss? Ministers are racing to prevent food shortages in the UK due to a sudden reduction of carbon dioxide used by the food and...
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. It's 11:04 this Sunday morning, and we've been talking about Insulate Britain. In the first hour, we were talking about whether or not the NHS is ready for whatever the winter throws at us. And I've had some thoughts and tweets from you which make your views pretty clear. We've got one here: no more restrictions would be accepted by the people. It's time we told them that we're not putting up with any more draconian rules. The NHS is broken, that says. The other one says that the NHS has a bureaucratic management head structure which has huge wastage and is slow to respond to our needs. If it was a business, it would have gone bankrupt years ago. Well, those thoughts, I think, are pretty clear, and my views are fairly similar to those. And I'll be talking a lot more about that in the coming weeks. We're now in the second hour, at the top of the second hour. We're going to move on to talk about the BBC, because it's just been announced that a newly created management post, very grand title, executive news editor, has just been appointed to a lady called Jess Brammer, a lefty from previously editor of the left-wing Huffington Post website, and you sort of question whether or not are they really continuing to try and be impartial? Are they continuing to try and be unbiased, or have they sort of given up on that? And what's the future now of the BBC post the reshuffle, given that there is now a new Secretary of State for Culture and Media and Sport, in one Nadine Dorries, who's previously been fairly outspoken about her views of the BBC? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Rebecca Ryan, who's the campaign director for the lobbying group Defund the BBC. Rebecca, a very good morning. Thank you for joining us on this Sunday morning. So, a little bit of change at the Department of Culture with Nadine Dorries being there, and I guess it's interesting to hear your thoughts. You know, where's your campaign got to in terms of you wanting to change the way the BBC is funded? Where's it got to, and what would you like to see instead, so that our viewers and listeners can really understand where you're coming from?
So where we've got to is that overnight, you know, when we launched, we got a huge amount of support. So there's a huge amount of public support out there for getting rid of the license fee as it currently stands, of having a license, potentially a license or a subscription model that just covers the BBC, so that people can watch live TV without, you know, on Sky or on Channel 4 or ITV or whatever, the places that are funded by advertising anyway. So that people are free to watch those things, you know, because it's already funded. And then if they want to pay for the BBC, they can pay for the BBC. That's, you know, so to separate those two things out. And there's massive public support for that. You see in polling after polling that sort of at least 2/3 of the country agree that the BBC license fee as it currently stands is completely archaic. But yeah, we sort of ran aground when it comes to sort of government making any moves on that. Pretty much when Dominic Cummings left, it seemed that was the end of any reform of the BBC's charter. But this last week with Nadine coming on board, you know, as you said, she's been a vocal critic of the license fee. So maybe we're starting to see some hopeful changes there. But yeah, time will tell.
And it, I mean, the government, you know, they've talked a good game, the Conservative Party, about wanting to reform the BBC, and we can all have a big debate about how it should be reformed, if at all. But you know, they've got an 80-seat majority. If they're not, and it seems to me that this has sort of gone off the radar completely, and to one extent you can understand that because of COVID. But on the other hand, actually, you know, this is a completely separate department that really has very little to do with the COVID crisis. And if they genuinely, you know, want to actually deliver on what they say, and that's a big question mark with this government, then surely they should be encouraging a national debate, putting forward some proposals either in a green paper or a white paper. But it seems to me it's like lip service. What's going to trigger a change, Rebecca?
Well, I think actually Jess Brammer's appointment will be a bit of a gift to us, because, you know, she is completely sort of typifies the BBC's woke bias, you know, and the BBC always sort of hide behind this, oh, well, the left, you know, the left call us biased, the right call us biased. So, you know, we're probably getting it about right. Well, actually, it's not really about left and right. You know, we have a huge amount of supporters who are sort of Labour, Red Wall people. And it's not about left, right. It's about sort of metropolitan woke outlook versus the rest of the country, which is sort of the majority of the country. And her tweets, you know, 16,000 of which have been deleted when it was, you know, revealed that she was in the running. You know, she, you know, she's a fully brought up sort of Marxist, you know, she supports the Black Lives Movement, which is a Marxist organisation essentially that wants to defund the police. And, you know, she's just completely typical of that, you know, the worst of the BBC, you know, what the thing of the BBC that people are most resistant to, and completely, you know, literally in bed with the Guardian, you know, so we can see far.
It feels to me that the BBC suffers for, actually, from what I think that the NHS suffers, which is far too much management, what I call the bureaucratic blob, that you know, they're all on very nice packages, lovely pensions. There's lots of chat about diversity and woke this and woke that. But actually, where's the value for money? Where's the performance? Where's the delivery? I guess the question with the BBC debate is, given everything else that's going on in the world, maybe folk just, my listeners and viewers, there just isn't the capacity to sort of really get. It's an irritant, but there's many other things that are a bigger irritant, a bigger challenge in one's daily and weekly lives.
Yeah, I think so. I think, as you said, there's a limited amount of government time on certain things. And when there's bigger issues, it can easily get pushed to the back. But, actually, you've got a huge amount of pressure coming from the other side, which is just actually how people live their daily lives. Now that the over 75s don't have a free license fee, many over 75s, the core of, BBC sort of, watchers, they look at it and they go, well, actually, I don't actually watch any of that TV, so I can live without it. That's fine. They've got children, grandchildren. You can show them how to use on demand. They don't need live TV, so they don't need a license. And then you've got the young people coming up as well, who don't, even really know that the BBC exists. So there's massive pressures on them elsewhere, and that's what we're encouraging.
Indeed, I mean, because the young, to be honest, they get their news in so many different ways on smartphones and tablets, and almost hardly ever. I mean, I know that. My own children never sit down and watch the BBC News or anything like that. They'll just get it through various devices, and that's part of the big change. But how do you progress this? Have you got a sort of a caucus of Conservative MPs that are trying to come up with a preferred model, almost like the alternative plan that people can get behind, can agree, or does it need like a bigger national debate? How do we get to the next stage of reforming the BBC rather than just just sort of wishing it?
So we've actually got an event at Conservative Party conference. We're going to hold a debate about what should be done with the licence fee. We've got David Davis is actually appearing on the panel, so we'll hear what he has to say. But we have had a number of Conservative Party MPs who have appeared on our YouTube channel talking about this, backing the scrapping the licence fee as it currently stands. So there is building momentum within the Conservative Party, particularly for MPs that are representing those former Red Wall seats, where they're very aware that if the Conservative Party tilts too far to the sort of centrist position, which Boris Johnson is sort of taking it down, that they'll be without a job in the next couple of years. So it's key. Unfortunately, it's the case that MPs that have a marginal seat are far more likely to deliver for their constituents. Yes. So it tends to be those that are very keen to do what was promised in the manifesto.
But in reality, there's so much pressure on ordinary families, daily and weekly bills, and we're going to be talking later in the programme about the pressure on energy bills, and there's food price inflation. So actually, the cost of the licence fee, it's real money. And people really notice it in their weekly and monthly costs. And actually, if it was changed, then that would make a big difference to people.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is what people don't realise as well. I think one of the things that's quite unjust is how the BBC communicates to the public about what who needs to have a licence and who doesn't need to have a licence. Because actually, most people aren't quite sure what constitutes live TV and what constitutes streaming and on demand and what have you. And the BBC play into that by making it deliberately quite unclear. When we make it clear to people, you can have a TV and you don't need a TV license. You can watch all of Netflix. You can watch the vast majority of Amazon. You can watch all of, ITV Hub on demand. It's just live TV that you can't have. And if the BBC were really clear about what it was that you needed a license for, and if the government made them be clear about that, you would see a massive drop off, which is why they're not being clear about it.
Indeed,
that's really.
I wish your campaign well. I think the BBC does need reform. I do think there's a genuine national debate to be had, and it's incumbent on the government to put forward plans A, B, C, and D for reform, so that people can have a proper national debate. Rebecca, thank you very much for those thoughts here this Sunday morning on Tice Talk. This is going to run and run. What is not acceptable is the status quo, given how people watch and listen and get their news and look at other programmes, other channels. The time is 11:15. You're listening to Tice Talk. Give us a call. Give us some tweets, some messages. 0344 499 1000. I want your thoughts, whether it's on the BBC, the NHS, Insulate Britain. There's so much to discuss. Give us a call. Let us know your views this Sunday morning. You're listening to Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB, and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter, quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. It's 11:20 this Sunday morning. We've been talking the BBC and we've been talking about the NHS whether they should protect us or whether we need to protect them. It's good to have a tweet here from someone who supports the BBC, saying that actually they do a good job in training people how to work in TV and presenting, and that none of the other TV companies does that. Then some other tweets coming in. It's fair to say that I think not many of the listeners and viewers would be putting up with any more restrictions. One here from says no more restrictions would be accepted. It's time we told them we're not putting up with those restrictions. It's fairly clear that people have had enough, and so I think there's no question that people feel that the NHS now has got to be ready for whatever the winter throws at it. So we've got a caller here, Amanda in East Sussex, who wants to discuss who she thinks is in charge of the government from my Sunday sermon. Amanda, good morning. Hi there.
Good morning, Richard. It's great to speak to you.
Good to speak to you too. Thanks for calling in. So what are your thoughts on who's in charge of the government, who should be in charge, and how they're doing?
Okay, well, I've got quite a different perspective on this because I spent 6.5 years living in the US before the pandemic. And so since I've been back in the UK, because when I was over in the US, I spent my whole time over there. I didn't even come back here to visit. And since I've been back here, I've noticed there are very disturbing parallels between the way that Boris Johnson's government is running the country to the way that Joe Biden is running things over in the US. And I find that extremely worrying for us as a country.
In what sense? I mean, 85 million people voted for President Biden.
Well, so they say. I think you'll find that there's probably a bit of a discrepancy going on there that will come out eventually in the wash. But what I mean is that the agenda going on behind the scenes as to who, as you pointed out in your sermon, who is making the decisions here behind certain things to do with the vaccination of the children and other disturbing things that we see going on, in terms of the court overturning the decision about the puberty blockers. It's the same thing that is going on in the United States. And a lot of it is being driven by advisors in the White House who are pushing a Black Lives Matter, an LGBTQ agenda that they really want to force on the populace. And I really do think that is what is somewhat going on behind the scenes in Number 10, Downing Street. So I think that we have got the same kind of advisors pushing the same kind of agenda behind the scenes, even when it comes down to the vaccination of children and the boosters, for instance. Mind you, the boosters over in the States, there's been some news on that over there because the FDA have just rejected the idea of using booster jabs for the whole of the population in the States. They've only recommended them for over 65s and the vulnerable adults.
Yes, I saw that. I mean, it is without question, the whole booster debate is going to run and run. But equally, I think I saw that Dr. Fauci was thinking that by Christmas, they'd be vaccinating children much younger than the age of 12, down to the age of 5 and possibly below. So I think these debates are going to run and run. And I think it's a really it's a big question for me. I understand the point about boosting the vulnerable, the elderly, but I'm also very sympathetic to the line of thinking, indeed, from the chief executive of AstraZeneca, Pascal Soire, when he said that actually he wanted more data. They wanted more data before boosting people, the over 50s, for example. He felt that the doses really would be better utilised giving a first dose to people in developing nations, for example, rather than a third dose to those of us here in first world countries. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I think he was dead right, actually. And also it's very well recognised now that these vaccines are actually what they call leaky vaccines. And because they're leaky vaccines, that's why the efficacy is actually waning after 6 months, as Pfizer has admitted, for instance. And the push for the boosters therefore will be never ending, because they're now saying that you're going to need booster jabs every 6 months. And I don't think anyone in their right mind wants to have to go and be jabbed every 6 months with this type of vaccine that has not even had any long-term trialling, that we don't have any long-term data on.
I think, Amanda, that is the big question. It's a bit like the flu vaccine, but obviously that's been around for so long, and some people are quite happy to have that every year or every other year. Personally, I used to have it about every other year because I sort of probably forget a year. But without question, I suspect that the booster take-up will be much, much lower than the first vaccine take-up. But this is, without question, something that's just going to run and run. Amanda, thank you very much for those thoughts. We're going to go now to Tony in Bristol, who I think has got some thoughts on the Insulate Britain protesters. Tony, good morning to you.
Hi.
Hi there. So you've got some thoughts, have you, about these protesters blocking the M25 junctions and so on?
Well, that's right. And also, but I'd like to also say something about the vaccines, because very quickly, because this is what's called scientism. It's not science. We've had all this, we're going to follow the science, we're going to follow the science. But then when the scientists say something that Chris Whitty doesn't like, then they just do something completely different, like vaccinate children. So it's not science. It's absolutely clearly not. It's scientism. And this is something that was looked at by people like C.S. Lewis in the 1950s. You know, they're saying here that this is using science for your own financial, political agenda. Anyway, look, on to the Extinction Rebellion. Reason I wanted to call is because I worked with George Monbiot back in the 1990s.
Oh, yes.
I'm a campaigning journalist now, and still do some environmental campaigning. But as far as I can see, there's absolutely no sense whatsoever to trying to stop these cars on the M25. First of all, you're targeting with a disruption the very people you're trying to bring on side.
Exactly.
That doesn't seem to make sense to me as an environmental campaigner that's been involved in land occupations and things like that over the years at all. You know, what's happening is the car is actually right now, and car drivers are one of the big successes of the climate people and the Extinction Rebellion. For example, we've got thousands and thousands now of people buying electric cars. This is an enormous success for them. And the other thing, which is even worse, is that London is now about to have £30 to drive into anywhere within the North Circular and South Circular roads, a massive extra charge. So they have been incredibly successful, Richard, when it comes to cars. And yet they've decided in this absolutely unhinged fashion to target the car drivers. I don't get it at all.
Well, Tony, I think you're absolutely right. And I speak as a 100% electric car owner myself. I love the electric car I've got. It's fantastic. But I understand that they are more expensive, but technology improves, the price will come down, and not only do they reduce emissions, but they lead to quieter cities, where of course so many people live. And I think you're right. I think that we understand the whole concept of people wanting to raise an issue, to protest, in this case about insulating more homes. That's fine. That's what protest is all about. But they've completely, I think in your and my view, shot themselves utterly in the foot, because they've upset so many people, they've disrupted so many people, they've frustrated and infuriated so many people that they're doing a danger to their cause.
Well, I mean, as an environmental journalist, I brought a book out earlier this year about secret power. It's called The Siege of Heaven Reader, which is looking at secret power over the centuries. And I think what's going on here, my question is it an accident that they've made this idiotic decision to try and block the very people that they're trying to get on board with their debate? Or is it deliberate? Because it looks to me as if there is an element of the direction that XR has been taking, which is completely against what we would say is social justice, environmental campaigns. I look at George Monbiot, for example, and his attitude to the nuclear issue. We as environmentalists, many worked with him, and now he decided just after Fukushima to come out as a pro-nuclear person.
Yes,
now,
I know.
For me, the environment does not benefit from thousands of years of nuclear fuel sitting around.
Tony, thank you for those thoughts. It is, without question, this debate is never going to stop. I think the protesters have shot themselves in the foot. But tell me your views on 0344 499 1000. The time is 11:30. This is Tice Talk on Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Government to hold more crisis talks with the energy regulator over rising gas prices. Why is a new defence deal causing controversy for new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss? Ministers are racing to prevent food shortages due to a sudden reduction of carbon dioxide used by the food and drink industry. An increase in the cost of fuel has resulted in a deficit of CO2 gas, which is used in the process of meat production. The new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has defended the UK's security pact with the US and Australia amid a deepening diplomatic row with France. The AUKUS deal will see Australia provided with nuclear-powered submarines by the US and the UK, rather than getting conventional submarines from France. Liz Truss says it's a deal that may bring hundreds of jobs to the UK. In retaliation, France pulled its ambassadors out of Australia and the US, claiming the pact was made behind their back. Boris Johnson is heading to the UN and the White House this week for the first time since Joe Biden became president. He's expected to push Biden on the looming humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan and the potential of reopening UK to US travel. He'll also appear at the UN's General Assembly in New York to urge world leaders to take concrete action on climate change. Tottenham Hotspur and England legend Jimmy Greaves has died aged 81. Greaves was part of the 1966 World Cup winning squad and remains fourth on the Three Lions all-time top goalscorer list. The Spurs hero had been battling dementia for a number of years. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk on Talk Radio. It's 11:34 and we've been talking about the BBC, the NHS and Insulate Britain. But now we're going to move on to another topic that is affecting hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people's lives, driving people into bankruptcy because of the cladding scandal, the outrageous issue of hundreds of thousands of homes where cladding has found to be unfit for purpose following the Grenfell Tower tragedy. And yet this government, their proposed solutions simply just is not up to the job and is forcing, as I say, huge bills onto so many leaseholders. And I personally, as leader of Reform UK, I came up with a 3-point plan earlier this year, which I put to government to essentially to solve this problem. And that 3-point plan was very clear. It was a long-term funding and warranty solution. The second point was there would be no cost to leaseholders for cladding and fire-related items. And the third point was that the principle of the polluter must pay, the developer must pay if they're still in business. But instead, this government seems quite happy to force thousands of people into bankruptcy. And there is, of course, now a new person at the department for, it's hard to know what it's called now, but I think it's called the Department for Levelling Up housing and communities. Yes, Michael Gove is now has expanded his portfolio and is now head of that. And the front page of the Sunday Times clearly sets out Boris Johnson has told Michael Gove, solve the cladding scandal. Well, I'm delighted to be joined now by Giles Grover, who is the co-leader of Manchester Gladiators and the End Our Cladding Scandal campaign, to talk about where it's got to and what more the government is going to need to do. So, Giles, a very good morning to you. Thanks for being with us here on Talk Radio. I've been following this issue with absolute horror for many months now. I think the government solution has been woeful, and I know so many people have been receiving huge bills. Just give me a sense of the crisis that people are in, and how we can move forward, how we can change the government stance on this.
Hi, good morning. Good morning, Richard. Thank you for having me onto the show to discuss this scandal that still doesn't have a solution. So, yeah, I've been personally involved for 4 years. Our campaign's been going for 2 years. We've made some progress, but the scale of the crisis is just getting bigger and bigger. We had Robert Jenrick, the previous Secretary of State, make an announcement in February telling us all he'd ended our cladding scandal. However, the nightmare that people are living through across the country, across in Wales, Scotland, the northern areas, the Midlands, the southeast, we've still not got a solution. So we're welcoming Michael Gove's appointment because we think that he might be able to actually make more of a difference than Robert Jenrick has. Ultimately, we've said all along, it's all about the political will to actually protect us. They spent years saying that they'll protect leaseholders from costs, then it is unaffordable costs. The simple point is none of this was our fault. So why should we pay tens of thousands, in some cases hundreds of thousands of pounds, to fix this problem?
And as I understand, bills are landing on people's doorstep sort of by the day, by the week. I mean, so you live in a block yourself that it's affected, I believe. Have you got huge bills to fix it yet, or are you sort of living in dread of that landing on your doorstep?
No, so we've first got an estimate, I think it was early 2019, saying it'd be 2 million for 329 leaseholders, which is about £6,000 each. 6 months later, we're told actually it'll be £11 million to fix all those problems. So we've still got the same cladding that was on Grenfell, the ACM. That's still literally outside my flat right now. We've now got half of that funded, but ultimately, without any more funding, without a proper coordinated approach to this from government, then I'm still going to have to pay £20,000.
And have you? And have you still got the Waking Watch in your block then?
We don't. We've had it twice now. We do have alarms in place. That provides us a little bit more comfort, but you're still worried every time you hear a false alarm. We've had a couple of alarms in the last week or so where people have had to evacuate. We even had a small fire. So we're just constantly on edge. You're constantly worried. It's a living nightmare. That's all it is.
And Giles, is your building one of the buildings that's above 18 metres high and therefore gets a different level of compensation to those who might be below 18 metres high but still have the same cladding?
So there are actually 3 buildings that form my development. It took about 4 or 5 months for us to prove that one of the buildings, which one measurement had it at 17.95 metres, another at 17.7, and it took that long to prove to the government, to MHCLG, yes, we should be eligible for funding. So it became farcical, really. And we're seeing that repeated across the country, where some buildings, because the developers have gained the system by building them just below 80 metres, they're being told they won't get funding. So there just needs to be a fresh overhaul, regardless of whether it's 18.1 metres or 17.6 metres. It's the same issues that have been caused by the same problems.
I mean, for my listeners' benefit, the mad government proposal, which is being legislated on, was that if the building is over 18 metres high, then you'll receive government compensation to replace the cladding. But if it's literally just a few centimetres below 18 metres high, even if it's the same type of building with the same specification on the same new development, then no, that means you, the leaseholder, would have to pay almost all of that cost. They may give you some sort of small loan in order to help. But I mean, there's just no logic to that, as I can understand, whatsoever, Giles. Is that the key thing that you're going to be trying to get Michael Gove to move on?
Yeah, that's the whole point of it. That even Robert Jenrick on 20th of January 2020, he said that height was a crude risk, a crude way to assess risk. The point is, since then, we've been saying you've got buildings, many buildings below 18 metres. There's one building, Richmond House in Worcester Park, below 11 metres that burned down to the ground within 10 minutes. So it's not just about height. There's a whole number of other factors as well. And to force people who are living in buildings between 11 and 18 metres into loans, just because Robert Jenrick wanted to get the market moving, it's just a horribly unfair way of dealing with things. A lot of those loans as well, they're going to be more than the buildings worth, the mortgages worth as well.
And Giles, are you hearing of people who are literally now declaring themselves bankrupt rather than have to pay these loans?
Yeah, so we've had a couple of quite well publicised bankruptcies. There's been a few others as well where people are just starting to explore, what exactly is involved with that. We've had some people who are selling at massive cash discounts. People are just, after 2 or 3 years, just feeling trapped. They just want to escape. We've even had reports of a lot worse, to be honest, but I won't get into that.
Sure. Giles, thank you so much. Well, look, I'm going to keep campaigning on this issue. I still believe that the solution I put forward, no one's come up with anything better. It's a simple, comprehensive solution that will sort the job now in the short term, but also provide a long-term funding and warranty solution. Giles Grover, who is the co-leader of the Manchester Gladiators and End Our Cladding Scandal campaign, thank you so much for those thoughts. There has to be change. The government has to move on this. It's totally unacceptable in my view. Give us a call if you're experiencing it, if you're in one of those buildings. I want to hear your thoughts, your views about the cladding scandal, or whether you've got some family or friends who are trapped, who've lost an absolute fortune because of the way the government has mishandled this situation. 0344 499 1000. You're listening to Tice Talk. The time is 11:42 and it is Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter, quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio, the home of common sense at 11:46. Keep those tweets and calls coming in. We've got a tweet here from Brexit Duck. I'm so sure about the ability of the NHS, I've taken out private medical insurance. That is fairly clear. So keep the calls coming in. We've got another one here about who's saying actually it's not Russia that is responsible for the gas price increases, but the lack of storage. We'll be talking about that in the third hour when we've got the fantastic Sun political editor Trevor Kavanagh to talk about the political implications of the energy prices. Anyway, we've got Bridget in Surrey who is on the line. Bridget, a very good morning. It's still just morning. I believe you've got some thoughts on your experience of trying to get a GP appointment.
Yes, morning, Richard. I've been one of the lucky ones, but I'll explain how it all started. I've had sort of problems, and when you ring up, it's, well, can I make an appointment to see a GP? Oh, yes, have you got a computer, or can you go on the website, www, and they start to tell you. I went, right, so I've got to go on the website. So she went, yes, so then you have to do that and put down what the problem may be. And then I said to her, well, I've got asthma. And I do, is this what you call triage? And she said, yes. And I said, but you don't triage asthma patients? She went very quiet. And then she came back and she went, oh, we've got someone to ring you in the morning. I went, okay, who's ringing me in the morning? The nurse, the asthma nurse. I said, okay. She rang, 9 o'clock, very nice, young, sounded young, right, okay. Start giving her the problems. Oh, have you tested for COVID? And you want to bang your head. And you want to bang your head. And I went, no, I haven't got COVID. Went on about some of the other things that's going on. Oh, I'll get GP to call you back. GP called me back. Right, yes, we need to do this, that and the other.
And how long did that take then, Bridget, for the GP, from when you first called?
You go through one stage and then she tells you what she's going to do second stage, but it doesn't get done automatically. So when you've done the first stage, which is medication, then you've got to go back and you've got to go triage again.
And so how many days did that take?
Well, you have to take medication first, so you have to go through all that. So then week, 2 weeks, I don't know, and then you triage yourself again, going through all the same things, and the doctor's brilliant, she's lovely. So I did say to the GP when she came phone me back, I mean, once you get that GP stage, you're fine. It's just that you've got to kick your foot in the door to stop them from shutting the door on you.
And Bridget, was this? How different is it now compared to pre-COVID in your experience?
Oh, they've dismantled. The government have dismantled the National Health Service. They've done it deliberately. They think we don't realise what they're doing, but we do.
But I can't believe the government have done it deliberately. I mean, I am hearing very different experiences in different GP surgeries. I mean, ultimately, it's easy to forget. GPs are actually, they're self-employed. They're private practices, private businesses, as opposed to NHS employees. So you've got different practices are performing to different rates.
But when I asked her, why do we have to keep triaging through the different stages, where I eventually now have got to go to hospital next Wednesday and have something done, a procedure, and she said, it's what the government have asked us to do. It is not us.
Yes.
So who's basically fibbing, which I think this doctor was lovely, and I think she was telling the truth.
Interesting, but there is no question that different practices, GP surgeries, are adopting very different procedures. Indeed, I think actually some even different GPs within a practice. Some are doing more, phone and Zoom consultation, and some are very much, in the surgery seeing patients live. Bridget, thank you so much for those thoughts. Really interesting. That was Bridget in Surrey, and then we've got Anthony in Leeds. To talk, give us his question, his thoughts. Anthony, a very good, it's just good morning.
Yes, good morning, Richard. Morning.
Morning. What are your thoughts?
I'm about this bloody global warming stuff. It's on every day on news, global warming. I don't believe in it, to be honest. Because number one, it's always been heat waves in Britain. And you can go back to 1911. there was a heat wave then, 1957. There's always been heat waves. All this project is a middle class project. Working class people are not interested in global warming.
I think we may have just lost Anthony in Leeds, so we'll try and get him back. But there's no question that what I say is, look, climate change has been here forever, for thousands and thousands of years. There has been change in climatic conditions. You've had glacial freezing, you've had glacial melting over very long cycles, and there are different impacts on climate change, whether it's volcanic activity, whether it's solar variation, sea level oscillation. There are things that we actually know really very little about their impact on climate change. I think we've got Anthony back from Leeds. Maybe Anthony, there was a heat wave that interfered on the line between us. But so you're not buying it. Sounds to me, Anthony, as though you're not buying the whole climate change debate.
No, I've got some time to say is it's a middle class project, not working class people not interested in putting food on the table for the children. Not that. It's always been heat waves.
And
1911, 1976,
yeah,
1957.
just whilst you're off, I mean, there's no question that the climate is always changing, and it always has, and it'll never stop. And actually, as I understand, less people are dying because of extreme weather events now than, for example, 50 or 75 years ago. But equally, do you agree with me that actually, we do want to reduce emissions at a sensible, fair, proportionate rate, but what we mustn't do is burden the least well off, the lowest paid, with the huge costs.
They're not bothered about poor people. This country never has.
And presumably, Anthony, you like everybody have seen major increases in your energy bills. Yes,
I have. I have, because I use a key meter.
Right.
I put in my meter. It's cost me a lot of money, is this? All this wants stopping, it does. All wants stopping. But in other countries are interested about global warming.
Well, I think it's fair to say.
Why should we?
Keep going.
All them in Parliament are a bunch of cowards, comedians, and all these protesting on roads, the fruitcakes. That's what they are.
There we are. There is Anthony's very clear view that the Insulate Britain protesters on the roads are fruitcakes. Thank you very much, Anthony. That was Anthony from Leeds. Talk about his views on the costs of what's going on at the moment. The whole climate change debate, Anthony thinks, is being driven by the wealthy middle class, and that the cost is being unfairly, I think he's saying, and experiencing, unfairly burdening the lowest paid and the least well off. And in the third hour, we're going to be looking at that, talking with Trevor Kavanagh about the impact of the significant rising prices, the gas prices. We already knew even before last week that there was going to be in October a major hike in electricity prices. And I think it's incumbent, and I'm certainly going to be trying to make it clear just how much of our energy bills actually goes to overseas owners of our energy companies, very often paying for the huge renewable subsidies, which dramatically increases the size of people's households' bills, often by between £150 and £200 per annum. And this is real money. This is, it makes it so much harder for people to be able to plan properly, to judge their bills, to put food on the table, to pay the mortgages. It feels to me that we've lost control. We're no longer in charge of our own destiny in terms of being able to control energy prices, whether it's Russia or whether it's the Chinese billionaire that is the largest owner, I think, of our public utilities. This has a real impact on people's daily lives. Not only just the cost of it, but then we're also now worried about the very security of the supply. And this is absolutely fundamental. Governments should be making sure that we're resilient, that we are not dependent on overseas producers, generators, whether it's for electricity, whether it's gas or whatever. You know, whether it's electricity coming from France, for example, even then, given the state of relations as we sit here now with Emmanuel Macron, you know, you see what can happen and why we mustn't be so exposed. That's why we've got to be much more self-resilient. We've got to look at more nuclear power stations, you know, the contemporary modern designs of them, to make sure that therefore we are in control of our own energy destiny. You're listening to Tice Talk. It's 11:57, and this is Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB, and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter, quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV. News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Tottenham and government to hold more crisis talks with the energy regulator over rising gas prices. Government to hold more crisis talks with energy regulator over rising gas prices. For new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss. And after 3 days in space, the first all-civilian team ministers are racing to prevent food returns due to a sudden reduction of carbon dioxide used by the food and drink industry. An increase in the cost of fuel has resulted in a deficit of CO2 gas, which is used in the process of meat production and remains The new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss has defended the UK's security pact with the US and Australia amid a deep current England and Tottenham captain Harry Kane. The AUKUS deal will see Australia and one of the great goal-powered submarines by the US and the UK, rather than getting conventional Ministers are racing to prevent food shortages. Liz Truss says it's a deal that may bring hundreds of jobs to the UK. In retaliation, France pulled its ambassadors out of Australia and the US, claiming the pact was made in the process of meat production. Boris Johnson is heading to the UN and the White House this week for the first time since Joe Biden became president. He's expected to push Biden President Alok Sharma has today said there's no immediate potential of reopening UK to US travel. He'll also appear at the UN's General Assembly in New York to urge world leaders to take concrete action on climate change with France. The AUKUS deal will see Australia provided with nuclear power submarines aged 81. Greaves was part of the 1966 World Cup winning squad and remains fourth on the three that may bring hundreds of jobs to the UK. In retaliation, France pulled its ambassadors out of Australia and the US, claiming that's your news on Talk Radio TV. But Australia's PM Scott Morrison says he's doing what's best for national interest.
Australia's national interest comes first. It must come first, and it did come first. And Australia's interests are best served by the trilateral partnership that I've been able to form with President Biden and Prime Minister Johnson.
Boris Johnson is heading to the UN and the White House this week for the first time since Joe Biden became president. He's expected to push Biden on the humanitarian crisis and the potential of reopening the borders. He'll also appear at the UN's General Assembly in New York to urge world leaders to take concrete action on climate change. SpaceX capsule carrying the first all-civilian crew into space has touched back down on Earth after 3 days in orbit. It was the first expedition launched into Earth orbit without a career astronaut on board. And the Met Office has issued yellow warnings and risk of flooding and travel chaos. Rainfall is expected
online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live news on Talk Radio TV. Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Government to hold more crisis talks with the energy regulator over rising gas prices. Why is a new defence deal causing controversy for new Foreign Secretary Liz Truss? Ministers are racing to prevent food shortages in the UK due to a sudden reduction of carbon dioxide used by the food and drink industry. An increase in the cost of fuel has resulted.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. Good afternoon. We're into the third and final hour of my Sunday show, talking about a whole raft of issues. And at the beginning, I started with my Sunday sermon as to who's in charge. I was talking about whether parents or children were in charge of vaccines, but also a new Court of Appeal ruling at the back end of last week about who's in charge of the very, very sensitive decision about puberty blockers for people with gender dysphoria under the age of 16. And the previous ruling from a court, a lower court in 2020, was that actually that essentially parents had the right to decide for their children, because children wouldn't be able to give informed consent. But the Court of Appeal have completely overturned that, and they've essentially said that actually that the children aged 12 to 15 could actually decide to have these puberty blockers with clinician advice, even though it would be without parents' consent. And I must say, I think many people may feel very uncomfortable. Let me know your thoughts. 0344 499 1000. You know, it's a difficult topic, but it's important to discuss it, and that's why, you know, in the home of free speech, uncensored, we here in Talk Radio, we're prepared to discuss these difficult issues. I'm delighted to be joined by Tanya Carter, spokeswoman for the Safe Schools Alliance, to be able to talk about this. Tanya, good afternoon to you. So tell me your thoughts on this. You know, it's a difficult, sensitive issue, and in a sense, we've got the NHS Trust, the Tavistock Trust, that's continued to pursue legal action to suit its own ends, possibly even just to protect its own reputation. And I guess lots of people are thinking, surely, can this be right? What was wrong with the previous ruling? What are your thoughts?
Good afternoon, Richard. Yes, we're very concerned by the ruling. But if you look at the last paragraph, if you read the whole judgment, it does seem to be giving the go-ahead for people to sue the Tavistock who have been given puberty blockers as children, because the previous High Court ruling basically found that nobody can be consenting to these puberty blockers for under 16s because children of that age just do not have the capacity to consent to beginning on a path that ultimately can lead to sterilisation and loss of function. So you just cannot consent to that at that age. So if the Tavistock choose to interpret this ruling that children of 12 can consent to their possible future sterilisation, we would say that they're really looking at some serious litigation in the future from people like Kira Bell, who have been prescribed puberty blockers and have then grown up and realised that was not the correct course of action for them and that adults should have safeguarded them.
And Kira Bell was actually essentially a patient of the Tavistock Trust, and I think felt regretted the advice that had been received from the trust, and therefore brought this case against them. To what extent do you think this NHS Trust is really trying to defend its reputation on this issue?
Well, obviously, yes, that you'd expect them to try and defend their reputation, because there's a lot of concerns about their reputation. Just recently, they've just been sued by their own safeguarding lead, and they've lost that case, and they've had to pay her £20,000 because they basically tried to silence her for raising significant safeguarding concerns. She was doing her job, and they subjected her to detriment for doing her job properly. And they've lost that case.
And as I understand, actually, they had been rated the lowest rating by the Care Quality Commission, a rating of inadequate, relatively recently. So they've obviously got some issues. But in a sense, Tanya, the real question here is, what sort of numbers of children are we talking about? Because the Tavistock Trust is the only youth gender identity service, as I understand. How many children are we talking about that are waiting for assistance, for care through Tavistock?
Well, we're looking at ever increasing numbers. Recent years, there's been a 4,000% increase in girls alone. At one point, there was less than 100 children being referred to the Tavistock each year. We're now looking at 2,000 plus and ever rising. I spoke to a PSHE teacher recently who said after lockdown, she'd noticed an increase in male students returning to school who are now identifying as girls. So that potentially could be an issue in the future. Where's that going? There are ever increasing numbers. There doesn't seem to be the structure to cope with them. A lot of these children need mental health support and counselling and exploration into what's gone on that has resulted in this. Have they suffered abuse? Have they suffered trauma? Are they autistic? Are they struggling with same-sex attraction? There's a lot of things that need exploring here, not just fast-tracking drugs.
Exactly, and particularly drugs that NHS England, by their own statement, appear to indicate they don't know the medium and long-term effects of them. So where are children across the country getting that support? If they've got those mental health issues or anxiety or depression related to whether or not they're comfortable in their own biological sex, Tanya, are they getting that locally, or are they all having to go to the Tavistock Trust?
I think the sad answer to that is that they're just not getting support. A lot of parents are really struggling to access appropriate support for their children. Obviously, parents have started setting up their own support groups now, like there's Bayswater Support does some really good jobs trying to help parents. There's psychotherapists like Stella O'Malley who do really good work doing exploratory therapy with children, but there's just not enough of these people around. Children are being left on very long waiting lists to eventually access quite inappropriate treatment. Some are turning to the private sector, things like Gender GP and Dr. Weberly, who is currently, I think, about halfway through a 55-day hearing with the GMC about her fitness to practice after prescribing testosterone to a 12-year-old.
So,
that's an awful situation.
So, Tanya, essentially, it feels as though you agree. I mean, there needs to be more support, but it needs to be high-quality support for this sensitive issue. Tanya, in the interest of time, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you so much for your thoughts. That's Tanya Carter, spokeswoman for the Safe Schools Alliance there. Well, let me know your views. 0344 499 1000. We've got tweets coming in. We've got here one from Phil in Oxford, talking about who's in charge here, the children or parents. Phil says, 12-year-old kids are supposed to know what they're doing with regards to the jabs, ? He's clearly very sceptical. I think that there's another here about the call I had with Anthony in Leeds, talking about the issue of climate change. And Don from Barnsley says, ask any climate alarmist this question. Against which baseline are you measuring man-made climate change? Good question there. Well, after the break, we're going to be talking to Trevor Kavanagh about the potential energy crisis, the price crisis of gas coming from Russia, what's causing it, and we'll also be talking to Trevor about the submarine deal between what's called the AUKUS relationship between the US, Australia and the UK, and a rather grumpy Emmanuel Macron. That's after the break. You're listening to Tice Talk. The time is 12:13 here this Sunday afternoon, and it is, of course, the one and only home of true common sense. It's Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB, and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio in the middle of the third hour of my Sunday show. It's 12:17 and there's a couple of big, really important political issues this weekend that we need to talk about, and I'm delighted that we're going to be able to do so with Trevor Kavanagh, the political columnist from The Sun. The first is the issue of energy prices, which appear to be literally going through the roof as we speak. So much so that the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, is having emergency meetings with the energy providers twofold. Firstly, to make sure that the security of supply is secure and not a cause for concern, but also because actually so concerned are they that some of the smaller energy supply companies may even go bust if they're not properly hedged against these dramatic price changes. And this is something that's clearly going to affect everybody over the coming months across the whole of the UK. Trevor, good afternoon to you. Thanks for being with us here on Tice Talk. Hi. So, I mean, this has happened incredibly fast. We knew that electricity prices, I'd seen from my own supplier that bills were going to go up in October. But now it seems that changing prices from Russia has caused this spike in prices across the whole of Europe as well as the UK.
Yeah, it's taken me completely by surprise. I think the government certainly has been taken by surprise. Part of it, of course, as you say, is the decision by Russia to put the squeeze on gas supplies to Europe. Always long anticipated, this sort of thing. But also the fact that the government, this government and many others before it, have simply failed to do anything about preparing for what was constantly forecast as being an inevitable failure in supply, whether it's gas or electricity. We haven't done anything about nuclear power. We've phased out most of our coal power, and we've suddenly found ourselves in a position where two fertilizer plants, which provide CO2, which is vital for refrigeration and for the abattoirs that deal with livestock, have suddenly stopped producing, and there seems to be no immediate indication that they're going to resume.
What we're learning incredibly rapidly in so many different ways, Trevor, really because of COVID, is that the whole just-in-time supply chain in so many different walks of life, whether it was PPE, as you just infer, whether it's CO2, everything is so finely sort of stretched. It's fine when everything's okay and the sun's shining. But the moment something goes wrong, then actually strategically we're really exposed. We're very vulnerable, as you said, because we've essentially outsourced so much of our energy generation, our reliance on energy, to overseas nations, overseas provider, whether it's gas from Russia or electricity from France's nuclear power stations.
Yes, I suspect that you and I and many of our listeners will have thought many times over recent years, what happens if something goes wrong? What happens if there is an international shortage of this or that commodity, or aircraft aren't flying or ships aren't sailing? How do we keep this just-in-time system, which is so vulnerable, underway? And suddenly we've discovered that we can't. If it's really seriously disrupted, then we start losing the things that we take absolutely for granted, which is that we walk into a supermarket and there's our favorite dish of yogurt or blueberries or whatever it is you want to have for breakfast or lunch, ready for you to put in your basket and walk out the shop after paying for it.
And politically, this clearly is going to be very uncomfortable for the government, because it is, as you inferred earlier, all of this essentially outsourcing of our energy production has pretty much taken place under a Conservative government, both pre the Blair years and also since David Cameron took control in 2010. And, they've left us really exposed.
Yes, and it's a long-standing and predictable crisis that should have been dealt with. The nettle should have been grasped. I mean, I've covered this subject now for 40 years, and it's becoming top of the agenda over the last 10 or 15 of those years, that we have simply got no plans, and certainly nothing in production, to build the sort of power plants and supplies that we need to keep this country going. And the idea of winter fuel cuts have begun to haunt us for some time. And suddenly, as you say, this has apparently come out of a clear blue sky. It makes no sense, and I don't see how, in fact, the government is going to put it right. They keep giving us reassuring noises, but I can't see the answer.
And of course, it then must have implications on the forthcoming COP26 summit, because on the one hand, we're looking to the government's plan is to take very drastic action to reduce emissions, but I would say at a huge unknown cost, with a lack of transparency, but also, again, really exposing us if we have too much renewables, and it may well indeed sort of change people's views about the pace at which we look to reduce emissions if this is how we're exposed.
Well, I think, frankly, Richard, this is already happening. The broad general public is suddenly coming face to face with the real costs and consequences of trying to stop climate change. And this is, along with the national insurance contributions and other tax rises, going to start impinging on people's disposable income quite quickly, because it's not just on the areas of energy supply. I mean, well, other energy areas are petrol pump prices, which have gone up enormously in the last 12 months. And of course, the other thing is that this is not just Britain. The European Union is having exactly the same problems, Germany in particular, because it's phasing out all its coal power plants. It's an international problem, exacerbated very willingly by Russia. And
this is the extraordinary thing, isn't it, Trevor, that actually it states that we don't consider, frankly, particularly friendly to us, whether it's Russia or whether it's China, who are potentially laughing all the way to the bank at the way that we have literally sort of prostrated ourselves as a nation and essentially as a continent, and exposed ourselves, as you said about Germany. They've reduced their nuclear. I'm going to be talking about it. The party that I lead, Reform UK, we've got a conference in a couple of weeks' time, hopefully in the same city as the Conservatives. You may be up there, Trevor, but I'm going to be talking about the energy and environmental debate and putting forward some very clear alternatives. I've used this expression before. I actually think the Tories' net zero policy is not net zero. I think it's net stupid. I think it's going to be incredibly expensive, and I think that we need to be really pushing for more nuclear power stations, promoting Rolls-Royce's new sort of wave of potential power stations, these small modular reactors. They potentially are the way forwards. I'm a great believer in investing in new technology, but I'm not a believer, for example, in having China investing in our nuclear power stations, designing, operating and running them.
Well, absolutely not. And if you design and build a power station, if you're Chinese, the fear that they're going to plant something in them which makes them vulnerable to long-term, long-distance manipulation at some point in the future is a serious one. We learned that from Huawei. But what you've got is a government which is yet again been caught flat-footed and without a plan. It was caught flat-footed over the health service crisis, which we assume is going to come in the winter, and over social care. And Boris has been in power now for nearly 2 years, one way or another. One would have thought that he might have actually told officials, get working on this, because in a few months' time, we're going to have some answers. There are no answers.
Indeed. If we can move on, Trevor, to this big new submarine deal between the United States and ourselves, selling nuclear technology to Australia, which again seems to have caught people very much unawares, in particular the French, who've really have thrown their toys out of the pram. How significant a damage to international relations between NATO allies, let's not forget, is this, just given how quickly this has happened when France thought they'd essentially already stitched up a deal?
Well, personally, I don't see it as damage to our relations. I think it's actually a warning to the European Union and the French that they can't take us for granted, that they can't take the English-speaking alliance for granted, that they're doing nothing for themselves in terms of any form of military defense. They're not properly backing NATO. And frankly, they are not a reliable ally in the question of dealing with the threats which are there in plain sight from Russia, which is a mischievous nation,
yes.
and China, which is a malignant nation.
Indeed, and obviously Australia have had their run-ins recently with China. They were essentially the first nation to call for a proper independent inquiry in the middle of last year, and China really didn't react very well to that. They imposed significant sanctions, and I guess that's part of what maybe has triggered Australia's thinking, that they need to make sure that they really are more closely aligned with the US and the UK going forwards.
Yes, I think that Australia showed a huge amount of courage in demanding an inquiry into the origins of the COVID pandemic, because it was predictable and has since paid a huge price. I mean, they have put huge tariffs on Australian exports of wine and food, barley and all that sort of thing. So, I mean, they put their money where their mouth is, unlike New Zealand, which, of course, is one of the important, or was one of the most important areas of our Five Eyes intelligence agreement. But I think that this is a long overdue indication of resolve by the Western countries that can do something about it, and including, increasingly, you'll find India will be included in that they are prepared to stand a little firmer when it comes to Chinese expansion in the South China Seas and
And Trevor, just finally, who was the driver of this deal from the UK side, who perhaps we should be congratulating?
Well, to be fair, I think Boris was, at least as far as I know. This all went on behind Macron's back at the G7 summit, when he was strutting his stuff and trying to grab Biden by the lapels and lead him away from Boris. Meanwhile, in the the Carbis Bay Hotel on the Cornish Riviera, the Australian, British and Americans were plotting this in top secret.
Fantastic. Well, if it was Boris, then credit where credit's due. Trevor Kavanagh, columnist from The Sun, thank you so much for those thoughts on these really key issues of the day, the risk of rising gas prices and the big submarine deal between the US, the UK and Australia. The time is 12:30. You're listening to Tice Talk. It's time for the news here on Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. Tottenham and England legend Jimmy Greaves has died, aged 81. Government to hold more crisis talks with the energy regulator over rising gas prices. And after 3 days in space, the first all-civilian team ever to orbit the Earth returns safely. Tottenham Hotspur and England legend Jimmy Greaves has died, aged 81. Greaves was part of the 1966 World Cup winning squad and remains fourth on the Three Lions all-time top goalscorer list. The Spurs hero had been battling dementia for a number of years. Current England and Tottenham captain Harry Kane said, "A true legend and one of the great goalscorers. Thoughts are with his family and friends." Ministers are racing to prevent food shortages due to a sudden reduction of carbon dioxide used by the food and drink industry. An increase in the cost of fuel has resulted in a deficit of CO2 gas, which is used in the process of meat production. Online supermarket Ocado has warned that it was unable to deliver frozen goods because of a lack of dry ice. COP26 President Alex Sharma has today said there's no immediate concern. The SpaceX capsule carrying the first all-civilian crew into space has touched back down on Earth after 3 days in orbit. The 4 amateurs splashed down successfully off the Florida coast. It was the first expedition launched into Earth's orbit without a career astronaut on board at an estimated cost of £145 million. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. I can't believe it, we're into the last half an hour. We've been having some great discussions, including just then with the political columnist from The Sun, Trevor Kavanagh. You can't please everybody though. Bertie, he's tweeted in, talking head on radio rabbit hole. There we are. There's the you win some, you lose some. Well, we're going to be talking now with my next guest to talk about the risk of lockdowns and the NHS performance. We touched on it earlier, but I really just want to get a few more thoughts. Don't hesitate to call us 0344 499 1000, and also the topic of vaccine boosters, which hadn't really, I don't think, been fully explored. It's still evolving very fast. I'm delighted to welcome James Melville, the Managing Director of East Point Western Communications and a sponsorship consultant, to the show this afternoon. James, very good afternoon to you. And I know you've been a very active campaigner throughout the whole COVID crisis with regard to freedoms being taken away, with regard to the lockdown strategy, the rights, the wrongs, the pitfalls of it. And I'm fascinated in your thoughts, given what we heard from the Prime Minister last week, about whether or not people really will accept more restrictions as we go forward, or whether or not actually you think that maybe the NHS is going to be ready for whatever the winter throws at us.
Well, there's so many components to this, Richard. I mean, first of all, I think most people could well get to a point where they reach their line in the sand of enough is enough. There was an argument that the social contract was effectively finding ways to just stagger through till we got to a vaccine, but the vaccine has been rolled out across most of our vulnerable groups now. And here we are, where the government are still U-turning and developing all signs of further mission creep. We were told, for instance, way back at Christmas time, that there wouldn't be vaccine passports because they were deemed as illiberal and unethical. We were also told that kids 12 to 15s wouldn't get the jab because it was an adult jab. We were also previously told that it would be 17 million jabs to freedom. And here we are now with a discussion about further restrictions and lockdowns based on the premise of protecting the NHS. And I think a lot of people will look at that and have a problem with it.
And therefore do what? Essentially just refuse to comply? You said sort of enough is enough. I mean, Boris used the idea, or he suggested plan B was masks and more social distancing and presumably some businesses being restricted. You feel that actually people would just say, that's it, I'm done?
I think a lot will get towards that point. I think there's a certain amount, and it can work in favour of a lot of people in our traits as a society in this country, whereby we obey rules and we have a sense of stoicism and we want to conform. But just look at the collateral, and you know this as well as I do, Richard, just look at the collateral damages that built up over previous lockdowns in terms of good businesses through no fault of their own going bust, a spike in mental health issues, not really addressing kids' welfare, or elderly isolation, or giving the elderly the opportunity to do what they want rather than told to do something, combined with all the aspects about just losing our freedoms. We have waiting lists, for instance, with the NHS, if you add all aspects to it, of 12 million, which is an enormous spike, and that's causing the backlog with the NHS. And I think people will look at this and go, well, hold on here, what about the 12 million people who are not getting treatment? How are they being protected? Why are they protecting the NHS?
And of course, this is essentially the nub of it, isn't it? That we're going to hear this argument again, and I had a debate on it earlier in the show. Are we here to protect the NHS, or is the NHS here to protect us, the patient? And you can sense it. I'm already hearing that some hospitals are having to reduce their operations or stop them. You can hear this language coming back, that the NHS is in danger of being overwhelmed, and therefore we've got to take measures. What's your sense as to where people are when that language is used and they're faced with the reality of that, how people respond to that?
I mean, like with yourself, I've always been sceptical about that message, because my main argument regarding the NHS factor, which is like the argument was used in the beginning to protect the NHS, is, well, part of that social contract is if we pay our taxes, then we should be asking our government to protect the NHS on our behalf. So what, for instance, the Nightingales were set up, then decommissioned. Have we got enough staff? What are they doing in terms of protecting the NHS for the winter season? And I think people will get to the point, they've now had 18 months through this crisis. And if we're in a position where we get into the winter and nothing's changed with the NHS and waiting lists are still going up, and we've now got basically on average 1,000 home deaths a week through this crisis, because 80% of those home deaths are non-COVID,
That's right.
by the way. I think people will get to the point where, why are we protecting the NHS when the government aren't doing enough to allow the NHS to protect us?
I mean, what's interesting is, to date, people were very compliant and did basically what the government asked of all of us, really. And I think it's whether or not people faced with that crunch point again, which, there's every prospect again. I actually wrote an article. My view is that the government has to prove it's done something different with the NHS. It has to show it's got a proper plan B, which involves more capacity. So I said you should rebuild some or all of the Nightingales and use the retired medics to staff them. But do you think, James, also that people will take boosters if asked of them finally, or do you think people will say, again, enough's enough, I'm done with it?
I think, a lot of people just conform. We have that trait, and people just go along with that, and they end up trusting, follow the science. If you look at the aspects in what is following the science, with 12 to 15-year-olds getting the jab, and yet the vaccine authority hasn't given full approval of that. So why the government doesn't seem to be following the science at this point? But I think people will get to the point whereby if their businesses are being affected, their loved ones are suffering mental health problems, or they're stuck on a waiting list because they're not getting cancer treatment, and they've been asked to take another jab, and the premise of the jab was to unlock us and give us our freedom, and still we're in a very different position this winter. So majority of the country are jabbed up, but we're still locked down because the government haven't healed or solved or protected the NHS. I think there's a point where people will go, I've been pretty subservient so far, but I've lost my patience on this now.
Yes.
There's only so far coercive behaviour can take for someone to eventually go, no, I'm not having this anymore.
I can see that. I can see some real challenges, some real tension emerging at that point. We don't know when it will be, whether it's in October or November, but there's going to be some difficult conversations between the people and the government. James Melver, thank you so much for those thoughts this Sunday afternoon. This is, we're definitely going to be facing some difficult conversations between the government and the people, and whether or not they have properly prepared the NHS for what's ahead. People have been asked, and I think have been very compliant to do everything. But if the government doesn't do its side of the bargain, then people are not going to be very happy. The time is 12:42. You're listening to Tice Talk. We're approaching the end of the show. But don't forget, give us a call with your thoughts, whether it's on the Insulate Britain protests, whether it's on lockdowns, whether it's on the Russian gas crisis and you're worried about your energy bills. There's still time to call 0344 499 1000. This is Tice Talk, and it is, of course, Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB, and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter, quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
This is Talk Radio.
Across the UK, online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
This is Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here at Talk Radio. It's 12:46. We're approaching the end of the show, but we're certainly not approaching the end of your thoughts and your comments. Tweets pouring in about the Insulate Britain protests, disrupting and obstructing people. Dave, he says custodial sentences required. Someone else, DC, says, what about water cannon? A little bit of humour here from Conan, who says, when has the M25 and its junctions never been blocked? There may be a bit of truth to that. And Yvonne says, it took public condemnation of the police's lack of action before they pulled their finger out. So I think that, a lot of real anger and frustration at these protests. I suggest the protesters take heed from the public's mood and reaction. Meanwhile, we've got Keith in Staffordshire, who's on the line with some thoughts about the cladding crisis that we discussed earlier. Keith, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Richard. Well, the thing that I was thinking about was the products used for the cladding would have carried the CE mark, which would have been tested and proven, or so-called tested and proven. So shouldn't the culpability of the faulty cladding lie with the manufacturers, or even Europe, seeing as it's carrying the European mark?
No, it's a fantastic question, actually, Keith, and indeed there's some revelations in the media just in the last few days that many, many years, I think as far back as 2004, when they were coming up with new regulations for some of these new materials, that the industry, the manufacturers, actually, they were slightly horrified when they realised that their products failed the proposed tests, the proposed criteria, the proposed qualifications. And the regulators knew it as well. And yet, nothing was changed. The products appeared not to have been changed, and they carried on regardless. I think you're absolutely right on this, Keith. Are you yourself in a flat that's affected or a home that's affected?
No, I'm just ex-construction, and I remember when the Grenfell thing kicked off, and I do remember all the building inspectors were going crazy, like with worry about it all. But really, at the end of the day, you know that we've got a system in place where even a developer has to go through planning, and planning have to pick things up, and you've got a specification on materials. You can't deviate from that. And if you've got materials that you're using with the CE mark or like the British Kite mark, how can you,
That's right.
How can you be wrong?
I think the reality is there are so many people in this crisis actually who were at fault. You've got the building regulations, I don't think were up to it. Certainly when I was involved, I've been in the property business for many years, and I was involved in designing a skyscraper in about 2010, 2011. I was astonished that you could design a brand new skyscraper with just one staircase up to 50 stories high. I thought that was odd. And that's the inside of the building. And as you say, the issue of the certification of these materials. And it's interesting that, as I understand, very, very few countries allowed these materials to be put on the outside of high-rise buildings. I think literally it was just the UK and possibly in Dubai that allowed these materials above 18 metres. So I think a lot of people are culpable, Keith, and you obviously, if you're in construction, you've seen it, you understand it.
I do, yeah. It's probably all about money at the end of the day and greasy palms.
Yes, indeed. Well, Keith, thank you very much for those thoughts. I think you're absolutely spot on there. There are many people who are culpable for this crisis. In fact, let's be absolutely clear. The only person who wasn't in any way responsible, in any way at fault, were the leaseholders who bought their properties. Many of them bought them with the housing industry's marketing spin, what's called the NHBC guarantee, and they thought that gave them some form of useful warranty. They thought that gave them protection. They thought that gave them the comfort that the regulations would be sufficient, that the materials would be sufficient, and all of that turned out to be literally for nothing. And it seems very often that the only people who are being asked to pay the price are those who actually are not at fault at all in any shape or form, i.e. the leaseholders. I think it's wrong. I think it's shocking. I think that Michael Gove has got to be persuaded to change this. At Reform UK, we've got our own clear solution to this. It's just unacceptable that this government should deliberately force people into bankruptcy or worse in order to try and deflect the crisis from this cladding scandal. Well, that's the cladding scandal. We've still got the tweets coming in about water cannon. There's no question that the climate change lobby, they need to be very careful about the protests that they continue to do. Yes, they've had their day in the sun. They've raised the issue, but I think people are really cross. The idea that you can disrupt people's daily lives, stop people getting to hospital, stop people earning a living at this critical time is really winding people up. I can tell it from the messages we've got. I can tell it from the tweets we've got. It's just not right that you can have that impact. It's not right that businesses can be so disrupted. It's not right that the supermarket shelves and things may be disrupted because lorries can't get there because these protesters are causing such disruption. And I think there is not only a lesson for them, but I think there's a lesson for the leadership of the various police forces up and down the country. Actually, people want action. They want the police to take proactive, preventative action to ensure that people's daily lives, our ability to get on, to push on, to go to work, to see some friends, to get to the hospital appointment, the doctor, whatever. These are the critical things. These are part of our fundamental human rights. And, the chief constables, I think they need to have a good hard look at themselves and say, actually, we're on the side of the people. We're not on the side of the disruptors. We're not on the side of those who want to obstruct, who want to be a pain in the backside, who want to cause misery and grief and angst and anger. It's just not on. I really do think it is not on. Well, it's been a very busy show. We've covered a huge amount. We've covered the Insulate Britain. We've covered the question of who's in charge. And at the moment, I really worry that not many people are in charge of the government, not the right people. But the good news is that the person who is going to be in charge of the Talk Radio studio, without question, who is going to dominate the airwaves over the coming 3 hours, is the one and only Bob Mills, who's just entered the studio.
What a segue that was. Superb, absolutely superb. You know what made me laugh this morning? I was watching the film because the screens all around us. Which was the SpaceX space thing, is that? And it said the 3 amateur astronauts have just returned home. And I remember thinking, that's a phrase I never thought I'd hear.
Extraordinary,
An
isn't it?
amateur
An
astronaut.
amateur
I remember
astronaut.
in Rocket Man when he says, it's all the science I don't understand. It's just
Yes.
my job. I used to think, that's nonsense. You must have at least a passing knowledge of the science.
And it's literally just happened.
They're literally the amateur astronaut. Where are you going? I'm going up space.
Would you do that?
No.
Nor would I.
My God, I wouldn't dream of it.
Not a chance.
But to go, they don't go like up moon-like space. They just go outside the stratosphere.
It's a long way up, and I'm scared of heights.
Well, I heard it was the same distance as Peterborough.
I think it's far further. Listeners, viewers, tell us, what do you think? Would you go up in a space vehicle, however high, whether it's to Peterborough, whether it's to Edinburgh? I can't believe it. Tell Bob. There's no way I'd go up in one of
the
those
word amateur is just doctors and astronauts. That's the one word you don't want to hear.
No,
amateur.
Just not a chance. So what have you got coming up?
I've got a lovely show as always. Alex Horn's coming on to talk about the new Taskmaster. That lovely Tim Dunn. Have you seen him, the railway historian?
No, I shall look at that.
Fascinating man. Anyone's fascinating who loves what they're talking about.
For sure.
And then Jamie Lang of Chelsea, Made in Chelsea, and Claudia Clare doing our wonderful art review, our monthly art review, because we're
Fantastic.
a little bit cerebral on this show.
Yes, indeed. Well, don't miss it. Don't miss a second of Bob Mills's show. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you for watching. Thank you to my amazing production team who've done great work, who've kept the guests piling in, the calls, the tweets and everything. It's been a busy, non-stop show, and we really have covered the ground. And I hope that maybe this next week is not quite so mad as the last week, and let's hope that that proper grown-ups are in charge, not the children, as we saw decided upon last week. Don't hesitate to join me next week when I'll have my next Sunday sermon. Put forward some ideas about what I should talk about, but I think we need a proper discussion about climate change, about the green agenda, because I know that that's concerning people with rising energy prices. Thanks for being with me. I hope you've enjoyed Tice Talk here at the home of common sense, the one and only Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB, and on the Talk Radio app. Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter, quite terrifying.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.